Hey there, this is Alex Burkett, co-founder of Omniscient Digital, a premium content marketing agency, and you are listening to the Long Game Podcast. In this episode, I'm talking to Andrew Anderson. Andrew may best be described by his Twitter bio, the most passionate optimizer in the world. He's currently the head of site optimization at ZenBusiness, a platform that helps entrepreneurs start and grow businesses. Andrew has been a friend of mine and a mentor of mine for many years, teaching me a ton about the specifics and the technical aspects of A/B testing, experimentation, and analytics, guiding career decisions and thinking about how to grow within this field of growth and experimentation, and also really showing me how to sharpen ideas through public debate, how to think outside of conventional best practices, and really how to celebrate being wrong or being surprised about outcomes that you may not have intended or expected. This interview touches on a ton of technical and strategic aspects of experimentation, especially in the beginning, which of course are going to be interesting to those who are running A/B tests currently. But even for those people who don't run experiments regularly or currently, I implore you to listen. The frameworks and ideas that Andrew talks about with regards to testing are great mental models for other areas of business and decision-making, specifically in our case, content marketing and growth in general. They're just really good mental models and frames to look at the world. We do also explicitly cover how one might approach content and SEO with an experimentation mindset, as well as covering how and why Andrew got into writing and blogging, and how he constructs articles and how he comes up with ideas, which I find fascinating because it's completely different from the typical SEO model that we've talked about with a lot of guests and with our writing on Omniscient's blog. Without further ado, here is my conversation with Andrew Anderson. Like, what are you up to nowadays?
Yeah, absolutely. So I joined ZenBusiness earlier this year, and part of that was joining originally on the marketing side to run their optimization program. That encompassed kind of changing the discipline, changing how people do things, make sure people are aligned on how to act on data, how to think about optimization. From there, kind of evolved it into creating some process and a team around it to make sure we're doing things, shifting everyone from very much a validating what they believe should happen standpoint to making sure we're looking at everything that's possible, working with all the different leadership to educate them from design to C-level to product and head. Because of that team and because of the success we were able to do, I've shifted actually over to the product side, which isn't really that big a shift, and taken on a lot more of running the existing website and our funnel to help build out a lot of that same discipline and to incorporate a lot more of the discover and exploit methodology that has really led to some big results.
All right, so this is a deep one, but this is something I'm really interested in with talking to you all the time. Can you explain the difference between the validation mindset and the discovery and exploit mindset? I think so. Maybe we could start from like the framing of like how most people do conversion rate optimization and experimentation.
Sure. I mean, and a lot of people, testing or optimization is really just a way for some different group to go in. I have this one magical solution, or this other site is doing this, or this. I heard about this one tactic. Let's go try this out and see what the impact is. And so from that point, you've already decided kind of what path you're going to go, how you're going to tackle something, and you just want to see if it's positive or negative. And that's where you're just validating ideas. And the problem with this is that's kind of how we're trained our entire lives. You've gone through a school system, right? You're either right or you're wrong, and you get a gold star or you don't. But that's not how the best way to maximize outcomes or maximize profit if you're looking from an economic standpoint. Really what you're doing is limiting your chances to a binary of this was better or worse. And if you look at industry averages, it comes out to slightly under 10% success rate for most people. Even the
in terms of winning experiments, you mean?
In terms of winning experiments, ignoring all the problems with how most people do data analysis.
Right.
And that's even if people do a couple versions of the same thing. If you're just doing a couple executions of the same thing, well, that adds a little bit, it's really just still validating the same idea. Where discovery and exploitation is very much looking at this from using bandit theory, for those that don't know. And that's really where you talk about, you enter a casino and there's all these different slot machines, and every slot machine has a different payout, right? That's the same thing that you do in real life. Like every tactic you do is going to have a different payout. Some are better, some are worse, but everything has an outcome. And so how do we figure out which slot machine? How do we put money in enough slot machines to figure out which one pays the most while keeping resources back to exploit that information, put the most in the winning? And so what that does is really changes how you do stuff. Instead of looking at, this is the one way I think I can solve this, you can start with that. But really what you're saying is, we're going to focus on improving our navigation or improving our landing pages. And we're going to look at all the different tactics we can do that, and then deconstruct what the best way to tackle that in different phases and different steps are. Easy rule of thumb for that is that pretty much real estate trumps everything. Real estate is size, location, existence, relative position of items. And then the other three can be in any order for most sites, but it's usually presentation, and then function, and then copy. Give you an example for our current site. Copy is actually number 2. Sometimes that's true, sometimes it's not. But that's part of the learning process. Once we do that, then we try to test out as many feasible options, not just the one we want, so we can include that, but we try to build out a test pool of 6, 7, 8 different options and figure out what works better, so that we end up, from a math standpoint, we still have the same binary of this could be better or worse, but every option adds more complications, right? I can be better than the previous one. I can be worse than the previous one. I can be better than all of them. And so what you're actually doing is exponentially increasing your chances. And I try to shoot for somewhere between an 80 and 90% success rate, currently existing about 82% as of this morning. And so that's pretty standard. I've been 90% for most places. I've actually went through almost 5 years of never having a losing test. And this is with very difficult rules of action, much more than most groups work with. And the reason for that is, again, we're not focusing on just what we believe was going to work. We're focusing on what's possible and letting the data and the discovery of what matters kind of shift everywhere we go.
So in the discovery of what matters, I guess like we could take like a easy example of something like, let's say you've got like a landing page and it's converting less well than the other 20 landing pages. Like it's pretty clear in the analytics. So you're like, all right, there's an opportunity area here. The impact size could be big if we can at least get this up to par with the others. And you see some other landing pages in your industry using social proof, right? Like that's one possible idea or avenue. Or maybe there's like a bunch of iterations within that social proof avenue, but you're saying that like this validation mindset would be taking that first idea. Hey, competitor B is using the language 7,000 plus businesses use our tool. So we're just going to test that out, and it's binary. It either passes or fails. And the discovery mechanism is more so like you're still going to use that same insight on this landing page is a high impact area, but you're going to not throw caution to the wind, but you're going to be a little bit more creative in like what sort of options you're deciding to test there, or like how would you approach like what you would even throw into that feasible testing options given that kind of insight?
Well, let's take a step back. Just because one page is underperforming another page, that doesn't tell you anything about the efficiency of changes of those pages.
True.
But let's start with, this is the page we're going to tackle. So let's look at the assumptions and everything you said is social proof. Does copy matter? Does social proof as a concept of copy matter? Does execution of that specific 7,000 matter? And how does this measure against other parts of other changes I can make? So based on that and what resources I can come up with a test plan, right? I could say, does changing copy matter than layout? So I might do 3 or 4 different layouts with a change of copy for each one. So I have a couple data points for the execution of that. I can see the 2 different things, because like I said, real estate tends to trump. If I don't have the resources for that, I might look at copy versus presentation versus other pieces. So I might do a simple partial factorial MVT of my main copy sections. So I could look at whether the copy part of that is more important than, say, the presentation or the font or whatever. Let's say we're even going to do the copy. Okay, let's take that concept of social proof. What other types of concepts could I have, and what other executions of that? So I might end up with a direct value statement versus social proof versus a FOMO-based messaging, and test out 3 or 4 executions each of those. Now, I still could be right. There's still the possibility of that one message trumps it. But if you start looking at the permutations of all those, you're less than 1% chance, where the pool, the whole, is going to have a much higher chance. More importantly, when I'm wrong, I also get to learn something. See, when I'm right, the best case scenario is I just get what I was thought was going to happen. But all the gain, everything I get to learn about what matters, what doesn't, and go in different directions is when I go, hey, I think 7,000 works best, but instead this FOMO messaging worked much better. Okay, where else can I apply that? What other ways can I tackle that? Where does this fit into other parts of the user flow? And so those type of statements you can only do if you're testing in a way that not only challenges that concept, but also tests in multiple executions of those things so you have multiple data points.
Yeah, that being wrong, or I guess being surprised, is something that I find really interesting, because I've had to train myself to value that over the past several years of my career, whereas I don't think a lot of people think like that still. But the way I look at it is now it's kind of through expected value. It's like if I can, for a very low cost, add another option that I wouldn't expect to do anything, and there's really no marginal cost to doing so, then any upside of exploiting that, any upside of like that option being the best one, is fucking amazing, right? Because it wasn't something I was considering before. There was almost no cost implementing it. And now all of a sudden we can exploit that win. And I find that true. Like your example with copy is a very good one, I think, because what's it take? Another 10 minutes to write a different line that could be completely separate from like the idea you first had. And now you have that option. And now it could be a 20% lift or something like that. And now you could exploit that as well.
Well, it could be even less time, because a lot of times what happened is a lot of review process and trying to find the perfect piece of copy, where if you focus on a pool, let's say I come up with 12, I kill the two least I like the least, there's a lot less time actually doing that than all the normal overhead of being in the company. And so it actually frees you up in a lot of cases, and more importantly, gets to spend the time on things that really matter, instead of what I like to call bike shedding, where everyone's just arguing over this is the perfect line or not.
Oh, yeah.
Whatever that is. And that's actually a much bigger thing. But let's also take a step back, which is the discipline to focus on what matters as opposed to what you think matters. That is by far the number one challenge I face in every organization I've ever worked with. Cognitive dissonance between what you think is going to matter and what the data tells you is so complicated and so hard. And so before I even start working at the company to every moment, everything is about that education piece and creating the focus around that. And even when people are absolutely sure that they don't do that, I have the discipline. Here's how we're going to act. Here's how we're going to build a template for a test. Here's how we're going to deconstruct ideas. And you find people start loving it. Some of my biggest champions have been the people that hated it the most when they're doing that. But it requires absolute dedication and discipline from the very first moment, because it's so easy to want to tell your boss yes, or just do what everyone else is doing. It's so hard to get the discipline to really keep going in different directions.
Mm-hmm. I guess there's two avenues we could go here. So the first one is, I'd love for you to talk about your discipline-based testing methodology, and we can set that as a frame. Maybe let's just start there, because I'm also curious about how you apply that in different areas outside of just maybe CRO, because I know you've worked in more like broad growth roles too. But let's just start with the discipline-based testing methodology.
Yeah, so I kind of outlined some of the simple steps of it earlier, but the really discipline is, instead of saying, here's this concept of this validation or something, it's the discipline of always looking at what is the pool of feasible alternatives, what is the cost of measuring those, how can I act in a rational way, which is by far the hardest step. And again, rational here simply meaning the math 2 is greater than 1, and when 2 is greater than 1, I always choose 2. And then how do I apply that to everywhere else I do that? And so that happens obviously in conversion rate optimization or optimization of any kind, but the same thing can be from a content strategy. Instead of just putting all my eggs and making 40 articles of the same thing, can I build 4 different pools of 10 articles and see what performs best and then put my resource in that in the future? Or can I look at 4 or 5 different strategies for my paid acquisition side, or 4 or 5 different possibilities for affiliate groups and different ways to tackle that and find out what applies and what works best? It's trying to find ways to break up any concept, to look at the assumptions, and to have the discipline to say, even if I feel 100% confident this is the best way, until I have the data, I have to follow through with things. And the funny part is, if you have that discipline, you'll find that what you're confident about almost never works. I have a running joke that if I like something, it's doomed. And it makes you be very humble. And the more humble you are, the easier it is to follow through with that. But again, it's that first step, those first steps along the path that are the most difficult. The other part of that is the discipline part of the data, which I brought up a couple of times, which is if I don't know how to act on data. And so a common mistake here is people use like statistical confidence on tests, not having any clue what that actually means. If I don't know how I'm going to act, what I need to validate the assumptions of a model, how I'm going to act on data, none of this matters, right? I could have everything else in place, but I'm still just storytelling for what outcomes. And so like, if I don't know what my natural variances on site is, if I don't know what my normalization curve is, if I don't know what is actionable, what isn't from a test standpoint or from a SEO measurement standpoint, none of this works. So it's also the discipline to know that the data requires very specific ways you look at it. And again, it's the ways you look at it that matter. There's a million ways to look at it wrong. All those you just ignore. It's the one way you need to. And having everyone aligned on what you're going to measure and how you're going to do that's just as much part of the discipline and just a part of the success of this. So it's both the input and the output.
Man, the measurement thing is such a huge area because like I've moved across these different areas and like experimentation on a website is sometimes, I don't want to say straightforward, but with an e-commerce site, like you can kind of measure, average order value or revenue per visitor or something like that, right? You can attach a dollar value to it. But now when I'm in this content marketing role, it's like, what the hell do I measure? Like, cause if you do SEO, it's going to take 5-6 months to see any like payback period or feedback. And then there's shorter term metrics you could take that may be trade-offs. Maybe you take that short-term metric that you can track and you forfeit what would have been more important. So I guess like, how do you think about what to measure? Like what matters in terms of a KPI?
Well, I mean, end of the day, it has to have a direct relevance to your business. So here's a classic example from e-com, which is measuring people entering the cart. Well, that makes the assumption that there's a linear model between people entering the cart and purchases, or AOV and purchases. And I hate to break it to you, but that has never happened in the history of man. And so if you're not saying from an e-com standpoint, am I trying to get more people to make purchases or am I trying to make more money? That helps me understand, do I look at conversion rate or RPV? And by the way, this isn't of what I'm testing. This isn't of this one little area. This is everyone population in the test 100% across. I don't look at micro pieces. I don't try to break it apart. I don't try to get cute with everything. That's just storytelling. Well, that logic applies the same thing with SEO or content, right? If my measure of content is that it needs to lead to leads, or it needs to lead to people entering another part of a long tail purchase cycle, as long as I can agree that there's a direct piece and later measure how well that truth is, I can use that. But for most SEO, you really are talking longer term time strategies. So you'd say, after 2 months, if these things, or these 3 months, I'm going to do that. And that's why you don't just all do just SEO, right? You're going to do some SEO, you're going to do some direct content, you're going to do a little bit of everything, because all these things work on different time schedules. And so you need to know when you're going to apply resources or not. If I know I'm going to create a whole bunch of content and wait for 2 months, well, then I can plan my resources. If I'm just going to keep creating content, what's the point?
Yeah, what you said something interesting that I thought about in the SEO context too, which is like this e-commerce example of if you would use something like add to carts as an example. What the two things struck out there: one, maybe it doesn't correlate to business value, but two, it's pretty gameable. Like you can trick people to adding things to your cart through like clever UI tricks and language. And I see that with metrics all the time. So that's one of my like key things that I look for when I'm thinking about KPIs and metrics for teams. Is like, how easy is this to game, or like how easy is this to fake? And a lot of people in content will use something like traffic, or God, worse would be like social shares or something like that. And it's like those just incentivize totally the wrong behavior. Whereas, they're easier to track, but then maybe something more important but harder to fake would be something like leads from content, because then you can get the traffic no matter how you want, but it has to convert to a lead, and you can't fake that.
Well, the two classic examples are bounce rate and time on site, which I have an open challenge to anyone. If they can find a direct correlation between those and a site-wide success metric, I will. I've had that open challenge for 10 years, 600 plus companies. No one has ever found it. I'm sure it exists, just random chance. But that's a perfect example of where I can gain bounce rate. I can make stuff happen. I can make it easy to move to another point. But who cares? It doesn't matter if I get 1,000 new page views if I'm only getting one new lead, because the lead's what I make money off of. And so being able to say it's not what I think I want to happen, or I think this is how this is going to happen, but what's going to happen. So another classic example of that is I add a module to a page, or I add an engagement thing, or I add an email capture or something like that. The success is not people interacting with it. The success is what its impact is to the bottom line. You may want less people to interact with it. That same thing is true when we go back to the copy piece. Just because you have a piece of copy and it gets more people from point A to point B, it may be good. You may actually want less people to pay attention to an area. But if you're only measuring one small subset of things instead of the whole, you're always going to get trapped on that. My favorite example of this way back in the day is I was working with a very, very large company who was doing a recommendation engine, and they were recommending these 3 products. And they saw that the recommendation products of those 3 products went up 20%. And so they were celebrating and going across the company, and everyone's cheering. And then if you looked at the net whole, the total revenue was down 7%. And there's millions and millions and millions of dollars. And so if you don't have the discipline to look at the whole, it's so easy to find something to make you feel like you're successful when you're really not.
That's fascinating. So that made me think too about like these are kind of like test level metrics or campaign level metrics that you could look at, but then there's program level metrics too. And I think this is maybe the most common way that CRO programs are run. Maybe I don't know. I've seen this many times where you've got a baseline conversion rate across the website. Do with that what you will, because there's obviously I can't say the word heterogeneity throughout the website. But let's say your average website conversion is 1%. So that team then gets gold on increasing that baseline conversion rate to 1.2% next quarter. That's pretty common, right?
Unfortunately, by the way, the easiest way to do that is to stop getting poor traffic. You're not making more money. Yeah.
So that's what I was going to say is it's like if let's say you go viral on Hacker News or you get like a TechCrunch piece or something like that, which is clearly good, right? It's public relations, you get backlinks. There's some of those people are going to become customers, but it's going to convert much, much lower. So it converts at 1/10 the percentage, but it still adds incrementally 50 more leads. Well, your goal is shot, but then your business value actually is potentially increased. So what are you going to do? Just block all that traffic from your site? Or
when you're focusing on a linear metric instead of a marginal metric. So the marginal is how much gain or lift I have from a specific action, right? I improved this by 20%. Well, if this thing was already going to go up 30%, I improved it by 20%, it looks like 50%, but I'm only 20% responsible. Same way as if I was going to do down by 30%, I gained 20%, it's down 10%. Well, the 20% is still the truth. That's still the part I had influence on. And so being able to understand the marginal value of actions and only view those as those, and that requires some discipline in understanding causal versus linear analysis, which is something that gets over most people's heads, is very problematic. So the way I measure success for my programs is the success rate, you've already heard me mention, the average lift and the average revenue impact. I also try to make sure I do long tail post feedback so I can look and see how true that is. You're always going to see a range. The other thing to keep in mind, especially from testing or most of these things, is it's not a single value, it's a range of outcomes. So I always report things between, say, 50% to 100%, but I can get narrower if I need to. But it's not like I did this test, I'm going to make $322,000 extra dollars. That's not how the real world works. I'm going to improve this by 10 to 15%, and that's worth probably around this range. And if I do that enough, I will constantly see up. But I don't control if I suddenly have 50 times the normal traffic or if I have a really new source. That's not bad. Why would I penalize someone for that? What I can control what I control, which is what do I do with that population and my marginal impact for that population.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I totally agree. Controlling what you can control and leaving the rest to, I guess, serendipity either way. I think that does take a lot of organizational discipline because it's hard to say like, oh yeah, conversion rate went down overall by 10%, but all of our tests were positive. And like basically what we could control was good. It just turns out that the external factors weren't. So it's like, I guess you don't want to be penalized for things that you can't control or rewarded for things you can't control either, right?
Sure, but I would still be looking at to make sure I'm making decisions correctly, because if that's true, as said, then it probably means I'm not acting on data correctly, which is a far bigger problem than even test strategy for most groups.
Right. That could be a canary in the coal mine for sure.
Yeah.
How did you get into experimentation?
So I actually studied to be a high school history teacher. And everyone I know gets into history for different reasons. Like one of my favorite people study laws and how laws get passed and how they go, or how food travels across different populations. I got into history because every tale of history I knew was we thought we were going to do X and we ended up doing Y. We thought we were going to go from the East Coast to the West Coast. We broke down and we're now suddenly in St. Louis. You know, those type of things are all of history. And so finding the ways that things go against things was kind of what I was interested in, and testing kind of seemed like a natural focus. I actually started out in data and then went into business intelligence and then product and then in testing. But all those were kind of using those same things, kind of building out that discipline I mentioned about. And it's really been over way too long, 18, 19 years now, and keep learning and keep trying to focus myself and keep trying to do those things that I keep growing on that, because the things I learned even 2 or 3 years ago aren't necessarily 100% true now. And the things I learned when I first joined are true, but it's the want to keep learning, the want to keep proving myself wrong. That's what kind of led me into all this.
That's interesting. Let me ask you a question with regards to that longevity and in terms of like, you said you've been in different areas, but they all kind of touched on the same thing. They all used experimentation. They may not have said that. I was looking at your blog and you wrote an article a couple of years ago on things, they keep on changing. So this was all about how the marketing scene hasn't moved much in the last 10, 12, 15 years, right? Like we're using different words for these things, but essentially the channels are the same, the measurements the same, and the experimentation protocols and practices are still not good. What have you seen change since you first got introduced to what we know as experimentation? And what's still the same?
Well, I mean, obviously technologies have changed. Companies have gotten a little smarter in how they value themselves. So obviously we still see lots of non-profitable companies get lots and lots of money out there. Mm-hmm. The biggest thing that I've seen changed is that experimentation specific to itself has become something that is kind of ubiquitous. Like everyone assumes it's going to happen. They have no clue what it means. They've never seen it done right. They saw someone going to do it at their previous company, or someone has done it before, or they've worked with an agency, but they assume it's going to be there. So that's a big step from where it was, 10, 15 years ago. Unfortunately, with that has become the replication of some really, really bad practices, almost all pushed by vendors or different agencies that's out there. There's very much this negative feedback cycle where you pay money to get mediocre results, and they tell you it's the greatest thing since sliced bread, so you keep doing that more and more and more. That isn't new to CRO. I think SEO went through that even before that, but every industry and every subset of every industry has done that for as long as human beings have wanted money. But that has definitely been part of the optimization path that I've seen play out, and is now kind of on the next part of that over the last 10, 15 years. And I should comment, this is someone who's worked on agency side, vendor side, and client side. So I've seen it from all three perspectives.
What do you think some of the worst practices are that keep getting promulgated?
The worst one to me, even though there's a lot of really bad ones, is the people that say, I can look at your site, tear it down, give you these 5 ideas, and these are all going to work magic. Mm-hmm. There's lots of snake oil salesmen. Like I said, there's a reason why we use a term from the 18th and 19th century to describe that. It's the same tactic. It's, I have these magic bullets, or, hey, just copy this one thing and it works. I think this is how self-help books, the entire industry works. And so I've seen a lot of that. The other one that I think is the worst is people that come from a specific discipline, usually analytics or design, who say, if you just follow these exact same things that this discipline's already doing, but validate it with this testing, you'll see it's the greatest thing. So they're not actually testing. They're not actually optimizing. They're just putting that sheen on the same old story that they've been doing in that discipline.
Wait, so you mean a designer taking like design best practices essentially and just kind of applying them through the lens of an A/B test? Or
yeah, we're going to test this all out and you're going to see how great it is. And that's what our A things, we have all this great design background, or, hey, I can do this, a lot of this linear analysis, so I can tell you exactly where your problems are, and we're going to solve it all. And testing's the way we'll show you that the impact of it is. It's just another form of validation, but it's just using testing or optimization as a tool to prove what you're already doing. Just give it a new name. And that's where you see a lot of people as expansion goes, right? You're pulling people from all these different disciplines and all these things. Those are the things you see the most often. The worst part on top of that is that you create an echo chamber where the same people are doing the same thing. And so they're being validated by the larger industry as a whole. That's not new either, but because the industry is starting to mature, you've seen that a lot more.
There's kind of a conflict between that idea of well, the person who says, hey, I can look at your landing page and tell you these 5 things to do, as well as the design person who says, I have these best practices and I know these are going to work. And the fundamental idea of experimentation, which is sort of like quantifying the uncertainty. And like there's the word uncertainty in that definition. Whereas like the other seems completely certain of the value of the ideas. It seems like there's some rift, some like gulf between those two ideas entirely.
That's because you're viewing experimentation as its own thing, or they're viewing experimentation as simply a technical medium to get their changes coded, right? Do this design principle. We're going to use testing to prove it. And testing is how we're going to get coded on the site. Or do this analysis. This is how we get this change. We're going to use testing as the medium to do that. Testing is not anything to do with A/B testing. Testing in that case is just a way around a dev team.
Yeah. And how do you conceptualize experimentation and testing? Like, I know you've used the words discovery and exploitation. I've heard, Nassim Taleb talks about tinkering quite a bit, and like the anti-fragile upside of small risks with like a capped downside. But like, how do you conceptualize this whole thing that we call experimentation, testing, CRO, whatever it is?
So way back when I first started a product way too long ago, I got some really good advice by a very famous name that I don't really want to mention right now. But she mentioned that product is really the discipline to look at three things and balance them. It's what users want, what users need, and what the business needs. And companies get out of control, get out of success when they focus on only one or two of those and they don't balance those three. So to me, what users want, I can get very easy. But what users need, that's where experimentation comes in. That's where I can actually measure those things and do that. And the more ways I can create decision points where I can discover and go in different directions and use this kind of feed future things and to figure out what's best, that helps shape that entire strategy and helps me view it as part of that holistic whole. Like I can't be successful without that because there's no way I could interview 1 million users and they could all tell me that they like red over blue, but it does not mean that red is better than blue. It just tells me that they say that red is more than blue. I mean, Malcolm Gladwell talks about this all the time. What the need part there is 100% down to how do I discover what they need? How do I figure out, give them the option to see what they need and then do that. And then I can balance that between where the company wants and where the users want. So to me, it's part of the holistic strategy. It's just a means to an end of creating decision points in the discovery. And so the more of those, the more I can tinker, the more I can keep my costs low, the more I can come up with feasible alternatives, the more I can get every part of this machine to be more efficient, the lower the cost, the more the gain I from that. It's when everything becomes this massive effort that even if I wanted to do that, then the cost overhead just gets out of the way. So it's both from the product discipline, or at least the business strategy discipline, and then the efficiency discipline. I'm always working on both ends of that, and that's kind of where it fits in.
Yeah, there's an interesting, so there, you're mapping it towards a goal, a business goal, and then there's like an optimization function within that, trying to constantly improve both the system and the outcomes. But what was interesting is you emphasize I think they call it stated versus revealed preferences. And it's kind of like when people like take surveys for who they're going to vote for, and then like they do something different in the voting booth. And I think our friend Rob Balin, who used to write for CXL, I think he wrote a whole article about this on like customer volition or something like that. Experimentation to you is a way to remove that entirely and strip away the bias and the justification, the narratives that people tell themselves when they're taking these surveys and these qualitative things, these attitudinal things, and just watch what they do. And to basically optimize based on that.
Exactly. Everyone thinks that we rationalize, then we do an action. But that's not how the human brain works. We do an action, then we rationalize. We just don't realize it because we think it the other way around. And so they could have the best of intentions. You know, it's the Malcolm Gladwell story of if you ask everyone what they want this dark, rich, heady brew of coffee. But what does everyone buy? Medium, bland, French vanilla with some cream in it. And there's a difference between what they think they want, what they say they want, and what they really want. And by testing and getting it down to the data and being very clear on those things, none of that matters. I could believe whatever I want. Like I tell people, I could believe I can fly. It doesn't matter until I jump off the roof and see if I can. I can take all those things away, strip it down to the barest thing, and only what they need comes to the forefront. And so that's another reason why I call it discipline. You know, it's taking away all those things, everything I believe, everything they believe, and into the day, it's what's better. Yes, no.
How do you map experimentation into a broader growth function? Like how do those pieces fit together in your mind?
Well, like I said, it could be discovering different channels. It could be discovering the efficiency of different channels. It could be discovering different tactics within those channels. The more steps I can take before that and figure out where I want to go and not be predetermined, like I'm going to do this tactic and I'm going to go after this group. It might be, hey, which of these 5 groups responds best, or which of these 5 content strategies work best? I know there's some cost overhead on that, but the worst case is I end up where I was. Best case, I end up with 2 or 3 that work, and I can split those out. Mm-hmm. So from a growth point, I'm always trying to get to 2 or 3 primary channels that can scale, and 2 or 3 that don't, and 2 or 3 tactics in each one. Well, only when I'm going to do that is from constantly exploring and measuring. If I just have 1 or 2 or 1 or 2 tactics, or I'm just doing the same thing I did before, either succeeds or fails. It's the same validation problem as before. And so I'm creating those decision points and trying to maximize my resources around that, as opposed to trying to plan my resources to this long tail strategy. You know, it's the in-arm bandit thing, right? The first part of the coins you spend is always on discovery. It's not on the exploitation.
Mm-hmm. How much, that's really interesting. It's almost like experimentation is the kind of domain agnostic methodology, and growth would be like the function to which you're optimizing. It's like through which channels you're going to grow the business, whatever growth means for you. How much would you kind of narrow down in terms of like what options you would test there? Because I know like on a website you want to like I think you've used the term increase the beta of options or something where it's like you're really trying to like get the broadest array of differences among the things you're testing. But when it comes to channel testing, sometimes there's more cost associated with that, right? Like pink versus black on a website, like that's an easy thing to set up. But you know, spinning up a small team maybe, or like hiring a contractor to test out Instagram ads versus content, like there's a little bit more of a upfront cost. So like, are you going to narrow those down? Like, do you approach like, I guess like the feasibility question differently when you're working on growth versus just like website optimization?
Sure, but there's two parts, right? You want the beta of the pool, which is, you know, the range of the options from each other, not from one point to another. So I can include what I think will work best, but I also need to look at everything else. I can have a lot more options from that standpoint, where if I'm looking at growth channels, it comes down to what's the minimum viable cost to get there and how many ways can I split that up. So I may end up with only 3 or 4, which is very suboptimal to like 10 or 11 on a website. But still, the more things I can compare, the higher chance of the outcome I get. And so the first question I have is, what resources do I have and what's the absolute minimum viable I can get for each channel, and test that out. It may be I do 2 or 3 simple ads on a different channel or simple thing before I even hire a contractor or spend money, and just see what the initial reaction is. I don't need it to be perfect, but I need to see if it's going to be within, say, 80% as a heuristic of successful, because then I know I can optimize it and grow it. But if it's coming in at 30%, every dollar I spend further on that to keep building out to even have what could be a minimal viable is a waste of time. And so, you know, there's certain things that most groups know that they need. They need to have an SEO strategy and probably a Google strategy that works, right, from a paid standpoint. But even within that, there's 1,000 different tactics. We've all heard them all. So how many different tactics can I look at those to figure out what's going to respond? And ideally, I don't even know with one that works. Like I said, I want 2 or 3, and so that I have the ability to shift as the market shifts. So I'm not over dependent on one thing. But if I just come in and say I have X amount of revenue and I have to make this successful, so I'm only going to do this one thing because that's what I've seen work, could be right. But every market inefficiency, every market change, going back to one of my favorite people in the scene to leave, is leaving you fragile. It's leaving you at risk. And so you need to create any method you can to enable that.
Yeah, this is really interesting, particularly from a selfish point of view, because we're building this agency, and the market for people hiring a premium content firm is pretty small overall, but then like the amount that are coming to our website is even smaller. So we can't really run experiments in the traditional way, but I want to build kind of a culture at the company and ethos that still operates by that experimentation mentality. So you know, part of it is because we all started this part-time. So we really had like a forcing function of like, we don't have all of our time and we don't have a bunch of money to throw at this. So we had to be really ruthlessly efficient with all the stuff we were doing. So I think it's one of our company principles is like test things, like minimum viable tests, essentially, where if we want to do a series of webinars, we're not going to sign up for 12 months or 2 years and put a bunch of money in. We're going to try a couple out and set like a threshold. And like, if we can get to this many attendees, well, surely we can double that after if we get here, right? Like this is enough information to tell us that this is worth going into. And we actually had to back out of a couple of tactics. With content, we knew we wanted to build some sort of content because, well, it shows that we can do what we're selling ourselves. But we tried to do this traditional SEO driven, you know, rank for keywords content play, gave it a couple of months, didn't really work out. So we kind of switched up then and kind of took a lot of guts to say, all right, we're cutting our losses and we're going to try something else now. But we've really tried to embody that ethos. I don't think we've really parameterized it or formalized it in any interesting way, but we're definitely trying to do how you're describing it as well.
Well, and 2 parts there. One, major congrats to you. That takes a lot of being able to handle risk and handle being uncomfortable. If you had followed through on everything that you thought you were going to do from day one, it sounds like it would have been a complete failure. But
you'd be burnt out by now. Yeah.
But part of adaptation was also you set parameters beforehand. You set how you're going to do it. You didn't just keep going and play it by ear and overreact to something. And so both those pieces are going into a discipline. The worst case scenario is I have this plan how to get from A to Z, and I follow those steps 100% and nothing changes.
Mm-hmm.
That means that you are relying on so much luck to get mathy. It's the Monty Hall problem. Or you can just keep learning and make it so much better chances that you're going to be successful, right? You still could be wrong, but your goal isn't, when I go into something, I can't guarantee what's going to do, right? I could play the lottery and I could win. That doesn't make it a great investment strategy. But I can look at different investment strategies and figure out what's going to happen and apply my resources as I learn. This is working. This isn't. That content strategy is working. It isn't. That's how most companies are successful. It's not they follow this perfect plan from day one. Like, have you ever heard any startup person that says that we knew 100% how this is going to play out the very first moment we opened doors?
No, and if I did, I would for sure think that would be a survivorship bias, halo effect type thing. Because I mean, it would probably be a rewriting of the story. I think most people are probably pivoting and learning quite rapidly.
And so, I mean, everyone's familiar with this. They're just uncomfortable with it. But if you can make that part of your culture, you don't have to give it a name. But if you make that from day one and you've set as many decision points as you can and you've accepted that, you're mitigating risk and you're giving yourself the best chance to grow. And every now and then you're going to hit a black swan and it's just going to blow up. And that's great. But I can't bank on that. But I can bank on my ability to keep discovering.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I do think with some of these channels, there's a certain amount of like, I guess discipline. You have to kind of commit to a certain level. Like, I think Tim Ferriss talked about this with starting his podcast. He's like, I couldn't just do 1 or 2 episodes and then say if it was a success or failure. I had to give myself like 20 or something like that. And I had to make it fun for myself. And I had to set like this bar. And I think that's the important part is like you set yourself up, you're willing to invest in the strategy for a certain amount of time, but you're also willing to call the number beforehand. And that's something they talk about. Even I see a lot of practitioners in A/B testing talk about this now, which is great. But avoiding harking, hypothesizing after results, something.
Well, or
I don't remember what the word is, but it's like you come up with the hypothesis after the results come in, and then you're like, oh, I wanted it to be that way. Oh, this campaign didn't fail. It really raised our brand awareness, and it's like, was brand awareness the stated goal beforehand, or was that a justification afterwards? And just stating like what your actual pass fail number is really helps in terms of like your learning and ability to cut the cord.
Yeah, I mean, Texas sharpshooter, whatever we're going to give it a name for, is such a prevalent thing, not just in testing, but in every group. And then the other part of that is you can start p-hacking, where I'm just going to keep doing things until something looks like a success. Success and failure in everything you do, but especially testing, is determined before you do the action, not after, right? I can buy the ticket. It doesn't guarantee it's going to win. It may win, but I know the probability beforehand. The fact that it won or didn't make it successful, because I couldn't control that. I can control what I did up to the moment I made a decision. And so that's where it all comes from. And you are going to have, like you mentioned before, survivorship bias, and everyone's going to find this one case where they did everything right. But the last thing in the world I want to do is follow a strategy that 95% people fail at, or in this case, that 90+% of tests fail at. Like, what's the point?
Yeah, just a quick diatribe, and then I've got another question unrelated. But on the survivorship bias thing and kind of trying to reverse engineer the results, and this is specific in content marketing. This is a little bit of a high horse, so forgive me. But the past company that I worked at, maybe the one right before this one, lots of companies really try to copy their content strategy. But they started their company 15 years ago, started blogging 15 years ago, had a whole team and a bunch of capital to spend on writers, and they ranked for everything early on, right? And if you think you could do that now in 2021, maybe you should try to reverse engineer what they do. But it's like, if you don't have every single variable and all the timing and all of the other things that you're not including in that calculation, right, then reverse engineering somebody's success, like you've got a different deck of cards that you're playing with, right? So instead of like trying to reverse engineer it, you could pick some principles and set it up in a sort of experimentation methodology and really look at what the best case for you would be. But yeah, that halo effect is very strong in content marketing.
Well, even if they did the same thing now, they would have to compete with them. So they
Totally
have
true.
the world up without them. And so it's also irrelevant what worked 15 years ago, because you're not in the market 15 years ago. What matters today? And so getting caught up on what your competitors do, or getting caught up on what the 5,000-pound gorilla in the room does, it's not what your job is. Your job isn't to go from 1 to 5. Your job is to go from 1 and figure out what I can influence above it, to use your analogy from before.
That's cool. I love that. Is there anything about CRO that you've changed your mind about recently, or experimentation, or whatever you want to say?
There's lot of small minutia stuff, especially on the math side. I think the biggest thing I've changed is I used to be of the believer that no matter what size of organization, you need an optimization team, an optimization discipline. I've since changed that to kind of what I described before, which is you need to have the discovery mindset in everything. The team that does that is irrelevant. By the way, where they sit is irrelevant. But if you don't have the discipline, you don't have the discovery mindset and try to build that into everything you do, that's where your failure is. So I used to kind of call the tactic itself the problem instead of the actual core thing that's causing the symptoms. And that's really where I've shifted.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been thinking about all of this as more of an operating system or mindset, even instead of like a key person or a team that owns like experimentation. I think that obviously is important in many organizations, especially at scale, but really like the idea of it has been what has mattered to me, and like treating problems as an experimentation or a bandit explore exploit problem. So yeah, that's interesting.
Well, and the other thing that gets out of the who owns budget for what, and it gets out of the I own this or don't. Like those things are noise and they happen in every corporation, every group. And that's where a lot of groups get caught up on. But if you view that as just symptoms of the problem, then you can actually deal with the core problem and those things just kind of go away. If everyone has the explore exploit thing, then we're all working towards a common goal, speaking a common language, and budget and overhead and who owns it is just noise. It's just an arbitrary decision.
Switching up, I want to ask you a little bit about your writing, because I think you were my favorite writer to work with at CXL, and one of my favorite writers to read when it came to conversion rate optimization. You had an ability to, you had the most unique and kind of original articles that I would read. It was you were clearly not just like picking a couple Google searches and rehashing some information, right? So a couple questions with how you approach that. First off, at a high level, why did you start a blog? Why did you start blogging? Why did you feel compelled to write in the first place?
So way back in the day, when I was first starting out, I got the opportunity to speak on this panel at eMetrics with a couple famous names in the industry at the time. And they admitted to me at the time that they like to throw grenades out and see everyone run from them and just pick up the pieces. And looking at that lens and looking at the place that was out there, there was such bad content in that same echo chamber that I mentioned before. And my job, especially at the time I was working for Adobe, was I was the guy that came in and cleaned up all the problematic programs that had gone sideways from either false promises, lying, doing all the stuff that all the experts said. And so I had this unique position where I could see what was commonly out there and I could see what's causing all these companies to fail. And I tend to be very passionate. Let's go with passionate. And so it was more of a point of frustrations like, look, everyone writes to the dumbest, lowest common denominator, and everyone just keeps trying to write the same thing with a different tone. And I wanted to address real problems, real things I was seeing, and try to tackle things from where the real diseases were, which is how people think, which is how people even conceptualize what they're doing. And so that's what got me into it. I have this passion. Like I said, I'm a history guy, so writing and reading and all those things are very common for me. And the other part with that is that no one was writing to an advanced audience. Like everyone was writing to the lowest common denominator. And so anyone that's read my writing, as bad as it can be sometimes, knows that I'm not writing to a guy that's thought about SEO or CRO for 10 seconds, right? I'm writing to someone who's been in the industry for a long time. And I purposely chose that voice and that way of tackling things. And from there, it's just kind of breaking down what the core problems are. I also tried to make sure that everything I wrote made people think. They may not agree with it, but I wanted to leave challenges to that and purposely write at a challenging tone that got people to get out of their comfort zone. Because even if you disagree with me, just being in your comfort zone is a dangerous thing, right? We're not discovering, we're not exploiting. And so those things sometimes are easy in a very violent rant type of way. The much harder thing was kind of adapting that voice into something that could be a lot more educational and a lot more growth. I'd like to think I got better at it, but I'm still known for my ranting and my very passionate responses in some cases.
All right. So this idea of speaking to the more advanced folks is really interesting because I think, this is like, I think sometimes we over optimize for palatability in our audience. And I think people like it when you don't dumb things down. Not everybody does. Some people are going to drop out, but for me, particularly, like when I choose podcasts or blogs nowadays, I almost want to have to rewind it or like to slow it down or to struggle through an episode or two, because then I feel like I'm actually learning something new, novel, and I get that feeling of excitement. I think this is something I've talked about with Pet before. The audience for beginners is massive. It's much, much larger. So the Neil Patels of the world are always going to have more people in their crowd. And it's almost like flash in the pan, though. It's like somebody comes in for their quick answer. They understand what is SEO and then they leave. Whereas like somebody stumbles on a really advanced article on the discipline-based testing methodology, or, some of the other stuff that we would write at CXL, or, some podcast from Sam Harris talking about free will and consciousness, right? That piques their interest. And then over time, they become a true fan of that content. So I almost feel like it's a slow burn, much more effective way, particularly about going with content. But I don't know. What do you think about that? Like, was that a trade-off? Like, how did you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it very much was. I will say this, that there was a podcast, since you mentioned You Are Not So Smart, that was also the impetus for this. The people that are beginners don't stay beginners. And you can saturate a market, but if it's already competed for, what's the point? But more importantly, it's also, what am I optimizing for, right? Am I optimizing for getting as many viewers as possible, or am I optimizing to have the biggest impact in the industry or get the most passionate people with it? And so, going back from the beginning, I always said I didn't want to write for 1,000 people. There's 10, 15 people that I wanted to really respond to. And I've been very lucky to make some great connections and help mentor some people and get some great things from that. And that's always been my success. And so I could optimize towards that. There is always going to be people out there that very nicely say that are charlatans that are going to put out whatever is easiest to digest. But their success and my success don't compete. We're not going after the same people. I don't want what they want. I don't want what they have. They certainly don't want what I have. But that doesn't mean that I'm wrong or they're right for what they're shooting for. I'm shooting to increase the conversation, improve the conversation. I'm always looking for people that can challenge my points or challenge what's out there to make me think differently. Every key thing I've learned has been from me going on a rant or from me having a very strong standpoint and someone going, no, you're wrong. And let's have debate about it and discussion about it. I'm happy to be wrong. All this comes down to, right, discovery. That means you're being wrong. And so if you don't have a strong standpoint, if you don't have a strong voice, you're never going to get that opportunity. Do you really want to work with a place where every single person agrees with you, or do you want to work with a place where everyone's challenging each other to be better?
Totally. Yeah. With our content at our agency, we've really been going into this angle. We do. So the podcast here, like, we pretty much let the conversation flow where it goes. There's going to be ideas in this talk that people in our audience don't understand. But if we stop to explain every single idea in like layman's terms, that this podcast would take 4 hours to get done, and like it wouldn't be interesting. So I think it's much better to just have the conversation as like we would normally have it for the most part. And we do this with our kitchen side episodes too. So we have this series where me and my two co-founders have like a topic or an issue that we've been thinking about. Sometimes a strategic thing for our company. Sometimes it's for an article we're writing. For example, we had one on what content marketers should be gold on, like what should their KPI be? And we have the conversation, we debate each other. And people have said that's what they like. They like to hear the honest disagreements. They like the fact that sometimes we say terminology that they have to go look up, but we don't sit there and be like, all right, here's what a goal is. That's not what we're trying to do. And we've gotten positive reception because of that. But more importantly, we have fun doing it. So we're going to continue doing it. I think I would quit yesterday if I had to keep writing content that was, what is content marketing type stuff.
Well, and steel sharpens steel. You're also making each other better. And so you get all those benefits, right? You're not drowning in the sea of the sameness. You're getting to challenge each other. You're getting different points of view out there. You're letting your audience catch up at their own speed. They can research at their own speed. Like, I congratulate you on what you guys have built. I love the content you guys are putting out there. But again, it requires everyone to be on the same page. If you and your other founders were going to different directions, it wouldn't work. And so again, it's being aligned on what the end goal of what you're trying to accomplish is.
For sure. Also on the idea of the panels and the disagreements, and you talking about steel sharpening steel. I've been on panels before, and I've seen many panels. And the most boring thing in the world is when three people get on stage and say niceties and agree with each other, and it's just banal and boring. And it's so much more fun when somebody speaks they don't have to be antagonistic and mean, but if somebody actually honestly disagrees and then there's some friction there. Justin Rondo, I think he's been at all the CXL kind of events and stuff. We did a panel in the Netherlands fully based on this because, we're good friends, but we would get into these drunken disagreements about different A/B testing things. So we got put on stage and we just picked like 10 controversial topics and just debated each other. And we had an empty chair on the stage. And we're like, anybody who wants to come up and disagree with us can come sit in this chair and talk with us. And it was hilarious and fun and entertaining. And we got really good reviews. It just goes to show how rare that is at a lot of these business kind of events.
Well, and that also speaks to how everyone's afraid to be different, right? It took a risk on your guys' end, but you got a lot more out of it. Hopefully the audience got a lot more out of it. Like we know that there's a risk there, but at the same time, we also know otherwise, if you go to a conference and you hear the same conversation, same presentation 55 times, what was the point? Outside of hanging out with your friends,
Yeah, hanging out at the happy hour, I guess, at that point. Do you want to do some rapid fire questions unrelated to experimentation and whatnot?
Yeah.
All right, cool. Who do you admire professionally and why?
Well, I think Nassim Taleb has come up a few times in this conversation. Obviously, he's my favorite challenging thinker. He has a very strong point of view. He tends to call people out. Doesn't mean I always agree with him or you can follow everything he does. It takes a lot of effort, but I love that the fact that he's always willing to be a counter voice, even when he's wrong.
Yeah, he's one of mine too. He also just clearly lives on his own terms, has created a universe of his own, really. If you could create one category in Jeopardy, what would it be? And would you get every question right?
I'm such a sports nerd and data nerd. It would be data analytics for the San Francisco Giants in the early 90s. And I probably would get every right. There was a point where I had literally every lifetime statistic from the Giants from 1989 to like 95 memorized.
That's amazing. I love that. Which talent would you most like to have?
I mean, I really admire people that are able to captivate their audiences in ways that I'm not. I can challenge people on their ideas and stuff, but I'm not the most engrossing. And I think that that's such a fascinating talent to build it out. I'm very much of the analytical mind instead of the show and actor presentation mind. And being able to mirror those things together would really change a lot of what I do.
Yeah, that would be an incredibly useful skill. Do you consider yourself more scientific or artistic?
Well, I think I kind of answered that, but I think it's definitely analytic. Scientific can have a lot of different meanings, and people completely misunderstand scientific method 99% of the time, as the vaccine debate will prove. But I would say analytic is 100% how I view myself.
Mm-hmm. If you could have dinner with one person, dead or alive, who would it be?
Oh, wow. I'm going to tease out from a history thing and probably say Andrew Johnson.
Okay. Any particular reason? Or
president and leader during one of the most tumultuous times and probably set up our country for failure for the next 55 years. And I'd love to hear his point of view. There's a reason why he's usually the lowest rated president.
That's cool. Yeah. What do you, I love this question. What do you consider the most overrated virtue?
Patience.
How come?
Patience is another way for a lot of people to make excuses for not taking action. There is the choice to take time, but we don't really call that patience, do we? We call that many other things. Patience, as most people understand it, is just let things come to me. And that's not what really happens. So if I had the ability, or anyone, to instill the ability to really make a decision and know what the decisions they're making is, and even if that decision is to do nothing, to accept that, that is definitely the number one virtue to me.
Mm-hmm. You already answered this, but you can pick a different one if you have a different answer. What's a career choice you considered but didn't pursue?
Obviously teaching, but I still think I do teaching. I still think I do it in a high school environment. I think I do that in every day and teaching discipline and those type of things. I Outside of that, I do think that getting into a more scientific field is always something I've been passionate about. I love learning, especially from a cognitive psychology standpoint or from those different standpoints. But I think that what I do now is kind of best merge of all the different things that do pique my passions.
That's awesome. Yeah, I keep thinking about like what career I should have when I grow up, quote unquote. And I do think experimentation, I think entrepreneurship is probably the most like just interesting for me, who has like the ADHD kind of brain where I can, focus on sales one day and culture and HR the next day and all that stuff. But I do, and this is maybe a function of ADHD, I dream about like these crazy specialized careers sometimes where like now I listen to podcasts all the time on like I don't even know what to call it, like neurobiology, like Dr. Andrew Huberman and Rhonda Patrick and that whole crew. And I'm like, what if I just went to school to be like a neurobiologist or something? But I'm sure I would get like 2 or 3 years in and be like, oh shit, I'm kind of bored with just doing this all day and just like reading papers and whatever else that entails.
Well, but I think you hit on something, which is the passion to learn about something is not the same thing as the career. You can apply that where you go. And so I think that that's where most people get confused. I think that entrepreneurship is the ability to take as many different things you learn about and take each of those different interests and apply them in a new way. And
I think that's the cool thing is the application with entrepreneurship.
Yeah. And so I think people confuse that all the time of I'm really interested in this subject versus I want to do this as a job. I can be really interested in any subject as long as I can apply it into real world situations.
Yeah. Well, that's the cool thing about writing too. And I guess you've probably noticed this with, because you intertwine a lot of interesting references into your writing. Like there's a lot of Nassim Taleb, there's a lot of economics, like you've brought in some science and politics and like all kinds of different angles. And it's like, I because of I don't write as much as I used to, but because I can write articles and I have a blog, every time I pick a book from my shelf, I'm like, there's potentially an idea in here that could be game changing, or I could put into an article or like a certain mental model that just like influences how I write this piece. So I feel like writing and entrepreneurship are two really cool ways to synthesize shit from all kinds of different spaces.
Well, it's also don't keep reading the same thing. If all I read was optimization articles, I'd be in that echo chamber. But if I can think about what I do and read economics or cognitive psychology or experimentation, or I'll be honest, one of my favorite ones a couple of years ago was illusions and how magicians change perceptions. I can apply that into what I do and it improves everything. It's not just I want to learn how to do a couple of card tricks, but those type of things, if you can take it in and figure out how it applies to the real world, that is actually learning. It's not just becoming rote pattern that you can memorize, right? Learning is taking information in and applying it to a real world problem that you're dealing with. And that takes a lot more effort, but it's so much more rewarding.
Yeah, I think also you didn't say you were artistic, but I do think that the essence of creativity is connecting those two ideas and creating something new. And that's pretty much what you just described, is taking two different ideas and pushing that into a domain where you can use it.
Well, I will hopefully add a little bit to my artistic score then, +5.
Love it. Just the last question, easy here. What blogs, podcasts, influencers, what kind of content have you been following lately?
Yeah, like I said, You're Not So Smart is probably the one I've followed the longest. Anything I can read on a lot of studies out there that challenge like the replication bias or different psychology studies or different ways of tackling different problems, or even how populations are dealing with real world problems and looking at different groups that took on different tactics. Let's use COVID example. How did Finland deal with it versus Sweden? And looking at those type of situations helps me learn from real world situations and apply those lessons, as well taking different concepts and applying them as well. And then the other thing is more importantly is just taking as many different inputs as possible, not just relying on one or two for any of these. Finding out what's real and what's not is really difficult in the modern world, and any single source is going to be problematic. And so you have to apply that to every new thing you learn about.
I love it. And I guess one last question, which is, where should people find you online?
You can always find me on Twitter, Antfoods, ANTFOODZ, or you can follow my blogs. There's a bunch still at CXL or testingdiscipline.com.
Awesome. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.